Assessment Objective 3 is all to do with identifying, evaluating, and analysing historical interpretations. You can include historical viewpoints throughout your coursework, but when it's used to support an argument you're making, it counts towards Assessment Objective 1. Only the evaluation and analysis of the viewpoints is considered part of AO3. So how many historical interpretations will you need to analyse, and how would you determine who a historian is? You need to include 2 interpretation evaluations, and they should come side by side in your coursework. And to look into this further, we're going to consider where we can find these interpretations. They can come from lots of different places. Looking through your Tudor course textbook, you will find that there are little extracts from historical viewpoints, which you could then research further if you wanted to. So they do sometimes exist in A-level texts. Obviously, you're going to find them in articles, you might find them in general histories, or it might just be that you have a historian's book. The 2 interpretations that you evaluate should come from academic sources. And what do we mean by academic source or an academic historian? In order to be an academic historian, their work needs to be published and it needs to be based on research that gives their interpretation. They might not actually consider themselves a historian. For example, back when I was in university, I went to a lecture by Andrew Marr, and he had just written his book, A History of the World. And he would consider himself not a historian, more like a journalist. But that doesn't mean that he didn't have interpretations worth analysing. What you must avoid doing, however, is evaluating an A-level textbook. By this I don't mean excerpts within an A-level textbook that take you to a historian, but the author of the historical A-level textbook itself. What does the mark scheme say? The mark scheme suggests that you should analyse and evaluate, in relation to the historical context, different ways in which aspects of the past have been interpreted, which includes showing an understanding of the limitations placed on historians, showing an understanding of the significance of the time and/or context in which a historian writes, and comparing and evaluating historical interpretations. For this reason, the study of interpretations should be on a relatively similar topic. So, for example, if you were looking at terror, it could be considering how far Stalin's terror was different from Lenin's. If you were looking at economy, it could be considering how progressive a particular Tsar was in terms of reforms. You could focus very much in a niche area that works for your coursework. So the first task for you is to have a look through the handout identifying interpretations. If I switch across to it now, you'll see there are a few extracts. I realise extract A doesn't have a provenance, but I can't locate whether that was a mistake or not. So for now, just read it as a piece and use the questions to help you understand its content more than its provenance. So it's asking you to look at whether any of these extracts offers interpretation, whether some of them are descriptive, which one indicates a school of history. Schools of history are something you look more at university, and it's not something you need to worry too much about in your coursework, but I have heard from the course coordinator that they prefer you not to get hung up on schools of history, and perhaps that would be something to avoid potentially. And which extract would you consider the most suitable to use in your NEA and why? Ooh, it's not going to let me go back. Here we go. When you come across interpretations, firstly, it can be a little bit difficult to identify what an interpretation is. I have found that it's easier to do this in class. But you're looking for something that's more than just stating fact or just describing an event in time. it has to have some kind of opinion, and if you can try to look for opinion, that would be the best. So I've got an extract here from J.R. Elton, and might be more relevant to the Tudors. Thus, the pilgrimage originated in a decision by one of the court factions to take the battle out of the court into the nation, to raise the standard of loyal rebellion as the only way left to them if they were to succeed in reversing the defeats suffered at court and in Parliament, and in forcing the king to change his policy. So there is an excerpt. You should be able to summarise the view of an extract you're looking at. So I've given an example below. Geoffrey Elton is putting forward the view that the rebellion was due to court faction, so that is interpretation. The faction had lost its influence at court and had decided that the only way to regain its influence was through a rebellion that would defeat their opponents and force the king, who was Henry VIII, to change his policy. The extract is arguing that the rebellion was due to high politics at court and not due to religion. So each time you try locating an interpretation, you should practice whether you can summarise it in your own words. It will really show whether you've understood it fully. So here's an example of another extract. The empire that rules the world today is both more and less than its British father. It has a much bigger economy, many more people, and a much larger arsenal. It is an empire that lacks the drive to export its people and its culture to those backwards region which need them most urgently, and which, if they are neglected, will breed the greatest threats to its security. It is an empire, in short, that dare not speak its name. It is an empire in denial. So it's all about, obviously, the role of empire in the 20th century. What I would like you to have a go at is summarising this in as few sentences as possible, just to get you practising, to be honest. So obviously it's all about evaluation, AO3, and analysis. So you've taken the first step, hopefully, in being able to summarise the views. Maybe you've picked a few historians and had a look at them. One way that you can track your progress with this is by drawing up a table where you can compare different viewpoints and decide which ones are the best to go forwards with. But you should be collecting them with a purpose in mind. What I mean by that is don't just go looking for historians without having any idea about what viewpoint you're looking for or what area you're considering. So try to think, okay, well, I'm really interested about this particular aspect. It might be anything from within your coursework. It can be, as long as it's obviously related to your coursework piece and you've discussed it, it can be something relatively niche. But don't just go reading in a book and just looking for opinions, because you need to find two interpretations and they need to be comparable. So to have an idea of what topic you're focusing on, is really important. So make sure you have an idea of what you're looking for before you go looking for it. And don't simply quote to provide a view. You need to obviously understand it and use your knowledge to interpret it. They don't have to be completely opposite viewpoints. Obviously, they've got to be compared. That doesn't mean that they have to have the opposite viewpoints. They could just have slightly differing viewpoints on the topic, and that is completely acceptable. When you're looking at the interpretation you found, you have to consider how convincing the view is, and this is how they're trying to link it back to the Tudors paper. So you have to look at how convincing the interpretation is, as well as the limitations placed on a historian according to the time or context they're writing in. How has the information been used? So that's about the content of the interpretation. Obviously, most published interpretations are likely to be accurate, but it's to do with how they present their information. So look at what they're including. Does your own knowledge either corroborate or contradict what they're saying? Obviously, look at the author themselves. Don't make sweeping generalizations about people. So one of the things I often see is, oh, so-and-so was, he went to this university and taught this and has done history for 25 years, so he's a smashing chap. it's not always very convincing. It's probably better for you to actually look specifically at their study and the work they've produced rather than being quite generic. And you also need to look at the context in which the interpretation was written. So again, not generic, but what specific time frame are they writing in? What events could have happened around that time to shape their viewpoint? Their country of origin obviously might impact that as well. And previous work they have published might also impact the way that they write. And then obviously understanding the context of the time frame is also important. Thinking about whether what they're writing is symptomatic of the time period they wrote in, because we know that obviously historians kind of go in waves of different thought. You just need to look at the Cold War really to see that initially there was a strong focus on how the Soviet Union was to blame for the Cold War. Then it sort of switched towards, okay, well maybe actually there was more blame placed around the US that was mostly prompted by the Vietnam War, and there was evaluation saying, okay, maybe it was actually both at fault, and now more of a postmodern approach is, or actually it's not to do with one particular side, it's a number of different factors that interlink. And the same thing happens for historical study of Russia over this period of time, and you'll see different waves of, pro-Tsarism, and then anti-Leninism or pro-Leninism, and anti-Stalinism, pro-Stalinism. So look into that a little bit. And then when you're looking at limitations of historians, you need to consider obviously if there's enough to talk about. So I would strongly advise you to do background checks on your historians, particularly if you found a really obscure person and there's nothing at all you can find about them. That might be problematic. You might find it difficult to do do enough research to find out how they're limited, so you might need to switch to looking at a different historian. And if your interpretations are roughly the same period, then you will find that you end up being repetitive. So try to pick historians that are different enough from each other so that when you're looking at limitations and their backgrounds, you're not writing the same thing twice. It's not very convincing to an examiner to see that you've fully understood the different issues facing historians. If you look at two that are almost identical, it'd be like looking at two Western historians who both published their work in like 1980, who are both American, have been influenced by the ongoing tensions in the Cold War. It's just not a sensible move. And other things to think about considering the date is important. If the author has a particular reputation, you do have to do a bit of digging. And perhaps more obvious is that there could be controversial topics or some that have provoked more debate. Limitations also could include difficulty in accessing source material. So the key one that we always consider is the fact that the Russian archives didn't open until 1991. And another example could be a book aimed at a mass market being much less likely to offer the time detailed factual support that might be offered by your story in writing for a solely academic readership. So look at who the book is aimed at, and that will hopefully give you some more ideas. I know that was a lot of information. It will come easier in time. The main key things I need you to remember from this is you're looking for historical viewpoints. Do your research first to work out what it is you want your historical evaluations to be based around, and then go looking into historical backgrounds so that you have enough to talk about in terms of their interpretation itself, enough to talk about them when it comes to their limitations and the time or context in which they're writing in, and ensure that the two historians that you've picked on are talking about the same topic, but their views don't have to be completely different from each other, just enough that you can compare the two against each other. It is unfortunate that quite often it's male historians, so if at any point during this discussion I've seemed to have stayed very focused on he or his, then that's probably the reason why. I haven't seen as many female historians speaking about this topic, but obviously go hunting and see if you can discover more historians that I didn't know about. And what you could do in the rest of this time is just go hunting for historians, really. Just have a look. If you've got some books that you've taken out of the library, have a little root around in those, see if you can identify interpretations. Doesn't mean that you obviously have to use them, but see if you're able to read through a page and spot the difference between description and opinion. I find actually that improves the more you do it. So obviously when I was doing my degree, initially I tended to write out information. Towards the end, I'd really gotten much better at of identifying interpretation over just factual information. And then if you have enough time, or you've already started this process earlier, then you could be looking into historians, their backgrounds. I've been told there's a number of places you can look. You can even look at Amazon reviews, for instance. There are articles written about people. There are book reviews written by people. There are obituaries if they've already passed away. There are university profiles. There's a lot you can find. You've just got to use the skills that you have and the internet that you've got at your disposal. Consider how fortunate we are as individuals to be able to just click and search certain people compared to perhaps people who 30 years ago would have had to have done everything through libraries and newspaper clippings. Hopefully that's helpful to you. And next, we will look at more into how we actually construct evaluations, and hopefully that will continue to give you some practice, some experience in it before you then embark on doing it properly for the first time for your specific piece.